So there were these people talking about paganism, and it always drives me crazy. Yeah, I guess it kind of drives me crazy when people talk about, I was going to say things that I don't quite approve of, but um, then I also realise that not everybody is a political activist, and maybe a lot of people, they just want to shoot the shit and say inconsequential things and say they wish and if only and wouldn't it be nice and, all these childish things without actually wanting to go about making it happen. I'm reminded of, I think it was an episode in Star Trek when the uh, the bald captain of Star Trek would say, "What did he? Would he say? Make it happen." Um, when somebody, one of his crew, talked about something, about a problem and proposed a solution, make it happen. And that this, in these circles, there's no idea of making anything happen. It's all, I wish, if only, wouldn't it be nice if we could witness wonderful pagan festivals of our, now that the season is changing and it's the second day of May, maybe witness a human sacrifice or two as performed by druids, Wicker Man, they're the kind of favourite things of Neopagans. They think it would be rather fun to revive human sacrifice and not really understand their own history and the function of the Abrahamic God as a concept. Unfortunately, I do mix in these circles, and of course, it's infuriating that they cannot be made to understand it, and their thinking is impoverished as a result, because instead of going about making it happen, they will forever, until they go into their graves, talk in these terms of, I wish, if only, wouldn't it be nice? And I know there are plenty of songs written about just these sorts of feelings. I think there's a Beach Boys song that goes, wouldn't it be nice? So songs are obviously a different proposition to political pamphlets, political manifestos, and for people who want to solve problems and make things happen. But what are we to do when people are just not able to understand, not wishing to understand in order to change their behavior, when most people are basically infantilized? And it's not that I don't try to explain to them, like, well, it would be rational to choose the most powerful God if you're going to choose a religion, and it would be rational to choose an official moral system if your current one is not working or is causing unintended results that are not in the national interest. But not a bit of it. It's all, oh, if only I wish upon a star. Wouldn't it be nice? I find when I'm trying to think of how to get things done, I come up against a lot of political blockages. So it's basically mental blocks of people who really, they either can't understand because they suffer from a learning disability, or they have an interest in denying what you say, because if they don't deny what you say, then they have to follow the moral imperative of doing what you say, and they prefer not to do what you say, and they think they can get away with it. But for how long? So there will be these people who think, my very, very limited aim is to pretend everything's fine, and as long as I'm not living through the correction or a revolution, I'm all right. I have fulfilled my very narrow and limited aim of never admitting my mistakes and before I go to my grave. But then that's because they understand that not admitting their mistake means they keep their pride. And if they say that all they care about is to not acknowledge a certain situation until they're dead, and they manage to accomplish this very limited objective, then I guess they have accomplished their life's ambition, which is to go to their grave without having to acknowledge their mistakes, or the mistakes of their group, or the mistakes of their ancestors. So what is it about paganism that I find so pathetic and infantile? I am, after all, an agnostic, so but I will acknowledge that it is my firm view that ethical monotheism is the best kind of religion for your civilization to have if you care about having an advanced civilization. But I realise that there are people who have, narrow and more limited aims, and they don't, they'll just make do with whatever crappy pagan gods that they can, salvage from their history, and, look at Thor and Odin and, these extinct pagan gods and revive them. This is not to say that I have not myself wanted, when I went to the Pantheon in Rome. So the Pantheon is this round building in Rome with a circle at the top, and it's got brilliant acoustics, and obviously it helps with the song and chanting and whatever. And the ancients, even before him, sort of understood acoustics, and there would be little, are they called shells? But anyway, there would be on the side of the circular building there would be. It's probably not called shells, but I'll look it up just to make sure I'm calling the building by the right name. Pantheon in Rome. Actually, it's got Greek pillars and stuff, but the interior is round, and it is a beautiful building. And I thought I'd let you know it's a round building behind these Roman pillars, and it's now called Basilica of Santa Maria and Martyrs, and it was a 2nd century Roman temple. And you can see a 3D model of it. Right, I guess I can watch the YouTube video of it with you to refresh my memory.
We're standing in the piazza, the square in front of the Pantheon.
This is the best preserved ancient Roman monument. And yet, look at the sense of age. Look at the weathering. Look at the way in which its history is revealed through its surface. It's been attacked. Its original bronze fittings have been ripped off. Look at the numerous holes, for instance, in the pediment that tell of all of the different purposes that this building has been put to. Originally a temple to the gods, then sanctified and made into a church. Now, of course, it's also a major tourist attraction. This is a building that has had just a tremendously complex history, and you can see it all over its surface.
We're seeing it very differently than anyone in antiquity would have seen it.
In fact, we're standing many feet higher than we would have been in the ancient world. Rome accumulated elevation from the debris of history. Once you would have stepped up to the porch of the Pantheon. Now we actually glide downhill.
And the space in front of the Pantheon was framed by a colonnade.
The colonnade and the other buildings that would have originally surrounded this building would have obscured the barrel on the side. And so that we would have only seen this very traditional temple front.
Exactly. It would have been something very familiar. And the surprise was what happened as you approached the threshold.
I have to tell you that I'm absolutely in love with those massive columns. They're supported by these enormous marble bases. They rise up unarticulated without any fluting and then end in these massive fragments of what were originally marble Corinthian capitals. These are monoliths. They're single pieces of stone. Unlike Greek columns, they were not segmented, they were not cut, and they were imported from Egypt, which was symbolic of Rome's power over most of the Mediterranean under the Emperor Hadrian, who was responsible for the construction of this building. So let's go in, let's go under the porch, let's go through those massive bronze doors. We just walked in under the strictly rectilinear porch, and then the space opens up
Into this vast circular space.
The width of the building and the height of the building completely fills my field of vision. And it is, in a sense, an expression of the limits of my sight. Unlike a basilica, this is a radial building. That is to say that it has a central point and radiates outward from that central point. But what's fascinating about this building is it's not a traditional radial structure in that the point would be on the floor. The central point, its focus, is midway between the floor and the ceiling and midway between its walls. It is large enough and geometrically perfect enough to accommodate a perfect sphere.
And as soon as you walk in, you notice that there's a kind of obsession with circles, with rectangles, with squares, with those kinds of perfect geometrical shapes.
This is a structure that is concerned with the ideal geometries, but it also locates our place within those geometries.
But the experience of being in this space is anything but static.
No, it's really dynamic, in fact. And one of the causes of that is if we move our eye up the columns, you can see that they're beautifully aligned with the frieze of false windows that are just above them. But then all of that does not align with the dome.
That's right. They don't align with the coffers that we see in the dome. What that does is creates this feeling that the barrel that the dome rests on is independent from the dome and almost makes it feel as though the dome could rotate.
That complex visual relationship between the dome and the decorative structures in the barrel remind us that this actual structural system here is dependent on concrete and not these decorative columns that we see on the interior.
Exactly. There's thick barrel of concrete that supports the dome. Because a dome pushes down and out, Roman architects had to think about how to support the weight and pressure of the dome. And one of the things that's doing that are the thick concrete walls of the barrel.
You know, the Romans had really perfected concrete, and this is one of the buildings that shows what was possible. This is shaping space because concrete could be continuous. It could be built upward continuously with wooden forms, which would then be removed and could then open this space up in a way that post and lintel architecture never could.
So concrete could be laid onto a wooden support or mold and could be shaped. shaped in a way that you can't do with post-millennial architecture.
Well, what it does is it allows for this vast, open, uninterrupted space. We walk into the space and we feel freed. We are given a tremendous amount of freedom in terms of how we move and how we see through this space.
Because of the Roman use of concrete, the idea that architecture could be something that shaped space and that could have a different kind of relationship to the viewer.
It is, even now in the 21st century, awesome. The Emperor Hadrian, under whose direction this building was constructed, apparently loved the building and loved to actually have visitors come to him here. One can imagine him even in the back apse opposite the entrance.
The Pantheon originally contained sculptures of the gods, of the deified emperors, we think. It really was about the divine. It was about the earthly sphere meeting the heavenly sphere.
And also in some way about human perception. Look how rich this surface is.
And there would have been much more in antiquity when the coffers probably had gilded rosettes. As we look at the drum, we see colored marble, we see purples and oranges and blues.
Remember, these marbles are taken from around the Roman Empire. So this is really an expression of Hadrian's wealth and Hadrian's power. This is the empire being able to reach across the globe to draw in these precious materials.
Perhaps the most exciting part of this space is the oculus, because it almost seems to defy reason. How could there be a hole in the center of that dome? It doesn't make sense.
Well, it's the only light that comes into this space, with the exception of some light wells in some of the recessed areas, and of course the grill just above the door and the door itself. There is one great window, and my students for years have asked, is there glass? And of course the answer is no. When it rains, the floor gets wet.
The perfect circle of that oculus, the perfect circle of the dome.
The oculus is critical in the issues that you had raised before. This is a building that in some way is a reflection of the movement of the heavens. And what happens is light moves into this space from the sun. It projects often a very sharp circle on the dome and moves across the floor of the building as the sun moves across the sky, and then eventually creeps up the other side of the dome. And so this entire building functions in some ways almost like a sundial. It makes visible the movements of the heavens and makes them manifest here on Earth. We've been talking about this building as a great monument of the ancient world, but it was admired and copied in the Renaissance, and in fact is perhaps the most influential building in architecture in the Renaissance and in the modern era. I mean, think about all of the different architects that have referenced this building. I'm looking down at the floors and the geometry that you spoke of, the circles and the squares, and I'm thinking about the pavement in front of the Guggenheim Museum on Fifth Avenue in New York.
Actually, once you know the Pantheon, you begin to see copies of it and pieces of it everywhere.
It's true. The dome especially is perhaps the most copied element, especially with the oculus. You can see that, for instance, in the National Gallery in Washington. You can see it in almost every neoclassical building in Europe and North America. But before we leave, I'd love to go and pay homage to Raphael, who's buried just over there.
You know, from Greek and Roman history, we have to consider why the Abrahamic God reigned supreme. And I think it's fair enough to use the Abrahamic God as a source of laws while still keeping all the beautiful architecture of the pagan past. What's the problem? If something is beautiful enough, it will be adapted by later owners of historical sites. A good example is the Hagia Sophia which has been a museum and a mosque and a church. I suppose I have to thank the pagans for a visit to the Pantheon of Rome, which is a truly beautiful building and makes you wonder what gods would have been there before Christianity took over. And I can well understand the longing that some of these pagans have for something more ancient and a rejection of Christianity, which has clearly failed them. So in that sentiment, at least, I share with them. But we must be practical. We must tidy up our minds and throw things out that are not useful, particularly if they can cause confusion and accident. So a good analogy would be that your home is full of junk, and if you're a hoarder, you're not really making the best use of your domestic space by hoarding all your junk, because if you hoard everything for the reason of it becoming useful, you will actually act against that desire, because if you keep buying things and don't store them properly or don't put them in an organized way, you will think, oh, I need a ball of string again because I don't know where I put the previous ones. So obviously, in order to have a tidy and well organized home, you would have to, put kitchen things in the kitchen and bedroom things in the bedroom and lounge things in the lounge, and be able to show to visitors and also to yourself that you are being somewhat organized in the landscape of your home. And obviously, if these principles apply to a great empire, it is all the more important to be organized. So what is the difficulty with these Westerners who go misty-eyed about their pre-Christian pagan deities that they never knew and only read about in children's stories, the Greek and Roman pantheon? Well, we have a lot of information about these stories and, the classics such as the Odyssey and the Aeneid and, all the other works of literature that I cannot immediately remember. But what is most important for us is how we organize our government. And it is only when something is logical that we rely upon it and we trust it, even though we don't like it. And that is really the power of logic and truth. Those of us who have been taught how to reason will know that we have to accept truth and logic even though we don't like it. But for many people now, it seems that they think they can defy logic and suppress truth, and that is not a good way to survive the vicissitudes of imperial decline. Well, it is true that for a while we can ignore truth and logic. There will come a time when it will no longer be possible to ignore truth and logic. And that time has now been reached. the West has gone through a period of supremacy and influence. And so there will be probably a lot of people who think they can indulge in their castles in the air to build their favorite fantasy of what they think the world should be, without a care about whether it's sustainable or not. The additional danger is that because most Westerners are now not married or do not particularly care about their children or for their children, they see no particular urgency in solving problems. Or they think, what can I do, little old me, when the world is so heedless, when the ruling classes are so arrogant and dismissive. But that doesn't mean we should just give up and die, does it? Surely we should ask ourselves, well, why do I have no connections? Why do I have no one else to pass this message of complaint to? If Western government is so great, if the Western political system so wonderful, there should be a ready-made hierarchical structure of giving orders to those below and reporting to senior leaders any problems there might be. The fact that nobody even thinks in these terms is conclusive evidence that nobody even trusts in the system. They only complain about it to their very close circle of friends who do not intend to do anything. And because this has been the attitude, they will be part of the problem. And I'm not expecting, any great political movement. The very little that I expect is for people to say, yes, what you say is true, what you propose would work in theory, something like that, and then they could go on to and ask the most difficult question, which is, well, how do you see it happening? How, bearing in mind how indifferent and moronic so many people are around me and above me, what do I expect to happen? That would at least be a start. Not let's just talk about old things and wish upon a star. And obviously, the more they do that, the more we get the impression the more likely we are to conclude that these people have no future. People who have no future only talk about the past, as you would expect someone on his deathbed not to take interest in the future. We expect a dying civilization to have people who take no interest whatsoever in the future. We expect old people to be set in their ways and not looking for change and not wishing to accommodate change and complaining about any change that has been forced on them. However, if we are to claim to be thinking people capable of solving problems, then we would have to apply our minds to discussing problems and proposing solutions, and not just retreat into fantasy, nostalgia, and sentimentality. I believe that the Abrahamic God is very useful indeed. I have said more than once that it is a self-correcting moral system that should should be used just for those reasons alone, whether or not we believe in God. If we have the hierarchy, then orders would be given and followed. But if we don't have a hierarchical system, then nobody would even know if they're in a position to give orders or know that they are expected to follow them. So that is why hierarchy is so important to any society, because people must know who they are, what they are, and therefore what they're supposed to do, than to think of themselves as equal to their leaders or their emperor or whoever is in charge. But the French Revolution, with its laundry list of liberty, equality, and fraternity, has given Westerners the idea that liberty is an end in itself. But it isn't. How can it be when my liberty to do something may interfere with your liberty to do something else? And therefore, although we all love the idea of liberty, we must necessarily agree that there are certain rules that must be followed by all in society. And by that I mean we should have a minimum standard of morality, and by that I mean agreeing to follow certain rules. When we agree that civilized people and advanced nations would, for example, have schools and hospitals and highways and airports and justice and a police force, that sort of idea. And for this reason, I find it infuriating that there are these aging sentimentalists who refuse to see the nature, purpose, and utility of the Abrahamic moral system simply because they have always hated Jews or Muslims. But perhaps all they want is to go to their graves complaining about these powerful religious groups that they are not part of, but never actually make the connection that their ever-lowering status and their ever-widening decline is caused by not having a proper system of morality. And the most basic form of that morality is the practice of marriage. The people I speak of are not married parents, and this, I think, explains their infantile. How do I say this word? The state of being infantile. Infantilism? Yes, I think that must be what I mean to say. And so, because they are not married parents, they are in a state of being infantile, and this means they will not be amenable to reason or exhortations for them to see the bigger picture and be their better selves. So this all goes back to the problem of idolatry, because obviously Neopaganism is idolatry, Christianity is idolatry, and the problem of idolatry is that they are depriving themselves of the opportunity cost of being rightly guided by the Quran. And this leads me to another point of frustration with them. They could challenge my claim, couldn't they? They could just say, well, what's the problem with idolatry? what's a problem with sexual immorality? What's a problem with all the things that are no longer considered to be a problem in our sexually liberated society? I think it should be obvious by now that our inability to think through our problems is the problem. So the refusal to accept truth, the inability to exercise logic, and the inability to be persuaded by admitted truths and admittedly sound arguments is their problem. They actually don't respect these concepts because they prefer to worship their own dumb opinions. I see Samuel Talmud is here. I don't know what gave you the impression that I hated Jews. I don't hate anybody. I'm always talking to Jews and Muslims and Islamophobes and antisemites. And trying to impress upon people that it is important to have a self-correcting moral system. But I don't get very far because nobody cares, because these ideas are too abstract. So there is this, I suppose he thinks of himself as an intellectual, but only in a way of displaying, knowledge of dead white men whose dead white ideas never got them far in the first place. So opportunity cost is an interesting concept, I would think. But I think a lot of Western intellectual energy is more directed at pretending not to understand what I'm saying than in acknowledging the truth of what I say. So this is all I'm going to say. I doubt that I said it particularly clearly, but for the avoidance of doubt, I will say again that the problem with Western man is that he worships his own dumb opinions. And this means that he shouldn't really be silent when I ask him, these pagans, the names of the pagan deities they worship, they always go quiet because, what they're doing when they call themselves Neopagans is to show hatred for the Abrahamic God and to say that they refuse to worship a Jew and they hate Jews and they also hate Muslims, and therefore in a kind of process of elimination, they're not, they're only left with neo-paganism because, obviously being racist as well as anti-Semites and Islamophobes, they would disdain to become Hindu or Buddhist because these are the religions of people who are not white, and they're just left with attempting to resurrect their extinct pre-Christian deities. And this is the mindset that I have to deal with time and time again. And this is conclusive evidence of the inferiority of their thinking and the inevitable takeover of forward-thinking people with energy, intellect, and a few principles that they might, from time to time, pretend to or actually defend. So thank you for your attention.